Hi, my name is Liam Wynn. I'm the founder and host of the Vertical Thoughts Climbing podcast, and today I'm going to be giving you a brief history of the sport of rock climbing, and I'm going to be touching on some of the major milestones along the way. So join me. Now, rock climbing, or climbing tall mountains, as it were, has been around for centuries. I mean, we're talking 14th, 15th century. Here was the problem, right? You're here, there's a large mountain here, you'd like to be here, is the thing. You gotta climb it, you gotta ascend it. So, climbing at the beginning was more of a necessity than an actual sport. And it wasn't until the late 18th century that rock climbing as a sport really began to develop. And kind of the dawn of the sport of rock climbing, or the beginning of mountaineering, or mountain climbing as it were, did not occur until August 1786. And this was when the first recorded ascent of Mont Blanc, the highest peak in the Alps, was completed by Jacques Balmat and Dr. Michel Pacard. And while this was not the only ascent of a tall mountain that occurred at the time, especially between the 17th and 18th century, this is what I would consider to be the landmark, or the beginning of mountaineering as we know it today. Now, moving forward almost 100 years, in 1869, the well-known naturalist and climber John Muir completed the first ascent of Cathedral Peak in Tuolumne Meadows, and he did it in hiking boots, and he on-sighted it with no equipment, free solo, unaided. My boy. And 6 years later, in 1875, George Anderson climbed to the top of Half Dome using eye bolts in the smooth granite as hand and footholds. Now, in the 1880s, the sport of rock climbing was really brought to fruition, and this happened in Great Britain. It also happened in Saxony, Germany, and in the Dolomites, which are a mountain range in Italy. And in 1886, Walter Perry Haskett Smith, or WP for short, as us friends like to call him, completed the first ascent of Nape's Needle in the Lake District of England. Now, this is and was one of the most iconic first ascents in history. This climb is still being done to this day. You can look it up on YouTube and see videos of people doing the same climb. Now, moving from the 19th to the 20th century, there's many significant events that occurred in the world of rock climbing that changed the way we see the sport. I'm going to be touching over a few of them. For example, in 1910, Otto Herzog created the first steel carabiner specifically designed for rock climbing. And in 1923, Willow Welzenbach created a numerical grading system to identify the difficulty of a climb. He used Roman numerals 1 to 6. And while this was not the first grading system, it was one of the first closed grading systems that was applied to the sport. Now later, in the 1930s, the Yosemite decimal system was put into place. This was a system originally designed to grade hikes and climbs in the Sierra Nevadas. The rock climbing application was put in place by members of the Sierra Club in Taquitos Rock in Southern California. The system is still in use today, albeit mostly in the United States. In most European countries, they use what's called the font or French scale. Born in Fontainebleau, it is unknown exactly when the scale was discovered or put in place, but it was likely around the same time period. 5 years later, in 1935, Pierre Alain produced the first rubber-soled rock climbing shoe. His feeling was that the climbing experience overall could be bettered with an application-specific shoe with an entirely rubber sole. He was right. He went on to make several first ascents in those very same shoes, at that time known as PAs. And to be honest, the climbing shoe has not changed much throughout the years. I mean, I happen to have here my climbing shoes, 510 Moccasins and 510 Team VXIs, along with my Metolius chalk bucket. Now, this is a good time for me to tell you that this video is not brought to you by 510 and Metolius, but it could be. 510 Metolius, my DMs are open. Now, keep in mind that climbing at this time was very much a developed sport. You had people climbing with ropes, belayers, harnesses in all different parts of the world. You also had bouldering becoming a prominent form of outdoor climbing in areas like the forests of Fontainebleau in Paris, France. And in the mid-1900s, there were many people responsible for ushering the sport across the sea to the western United States. Now, some of these western pioneers of rock climbing were, of course, John Muir, John Gill, Robert and Miriam Underhill, Warren Harding, and there's many, many others. That's just to name a few. And while these pioneers of rock climbing were developing the sport here in the Americas, they were also discovering new and exciting climbing areas. Some of the most well-known and most crowded climbing areas in the world are here in the United States, and specifically in Southern California. Jumping forward into the late 1900s, both the climbing and the climbers were getting much harder. And in the late 1900s, Jim Holloway sets the 3 hardest boulder problems in the world at the time in Colorado. The problems were meat hook and trice, which are now graded V11, and slapshot, which is now graded V13. Now keep in mind there was no V scale that existed at this time, so he must have just described these climbs as extremely hard. I don't know. There were grading scales that were put into place, but they weren't as specific as the ones that we have now. Now, I'm not saying the ones we have now are perfect, I'm just saying all he knew was these climbs were really, really hard, especially for the 1970s. Also in the late 1970s, a group fondly known as the Stone Masters were dominating Southern California climbing areas like Taquitos, Joshua Tree, and Suicide Rock. Of the Stone Masters, one of my personal heroes, John Long, helps to precipitate the art of speed climbing by completing the first descent of the Nose, a 3,000-foot route on El Capitan with 2 other Stone Masters in one day. In the following years, Long helped to popularize free soloing out in Joshua Tree during his high school years, and in 1975, Long free climbed the east face of Washington Column, later called Astro Man, and was the first and arguably one of the most famous big wall free climbs. Not to mention, Long's ascent of Hangover in Taquitos was arguably the first climb finished that was graded with a 513B, an extremely hard climb at the time. And in 1980, climbing equipment continued to progress. Boreal produced the first sticky rubber shoe available publicly. The shoe was named the Fire and kind of marked the beginning of a widespread climbing gear obsession that we still have today. I mean, we're all obsessed with our gear, it's true. And in the late 1980s, the V scale for bouldering was established in Waco Tanks, Texas by John Sherman. Now, the V scale is still in use today and ranges from VB, or beginner, to currently V17, which is the hardest climb on the V scale that has been done. Now, into the early 1990s, Lynn Hill free climbs the Nose on El Cap, and then she climbs it again in 1994, but this time in one day. Both ascents remain some of the most intense and respected achievements in rock climbing to date. And jumping forward into 1995, Fred Rowling climbs Akira and claims the route a 9B or 515B, which would have made it the hardest climb in the world at the time. Fred sparked controversy with his grading of the route, but nonetheless, climbers around the world were beginning to push the limits of climbing difficulty and to push the grading system to its very limit. Now, moving into the early 21st century, we have legendary climbers like Chris Sharma, Tommy Caldwell, and others who are really beginning to push the boundaries of the sport in a new way. They maintained and dominated the spotlight of rock climbing, while rock climbing media is quickly gaining footwork. We have, magazines, videos, all this content that's starting to be brought to the general public about rock climbing, a sport that they may know very little about. 2007 marked a big turn in the competition climbing era when several federations came together to form the IFSC, or the International Federation of Sport Climbing. The organization today remains one of the biggest and most prominent platforms for competition-style climbers. And in the 2010s and even all the way up to now, climbing is really gaining traction as a popular worldwide sport. But the achievements and the benchmarks, they keep happening. That's the amazing thing about rock climbing, is that climbers continue to push the limits of what is possible and what is not. For example, in 2015, young climber Ashima Shiraishi, at the age of 13, becomes the first woman to climb a 9A plus or 515A. And just 2 years later, in 2017, Margot Hayes becomes the first woman to red point a 9A plus or 515A. Now, we can't talk about the late 2010s without talking about Adam Ondra. You know him, I know him, we all know him, because the guy's everywhere. He's always watching, all right? Remember that. In September of 2017, Ondra completes Silence in Flatanger, Norway, and suggests a grade of 9C or 515D, becoming the hardest climb in the world and the only climb of the grade ever completed. You gonna question that? You gonna tell Adam Ondra he's wrong? I'm not. Good luck. And getting into more recent times, just this last year, 2018, Jimmy Chin and Alex Honnold got together to release their magnum opus, a feature film titled Free Solo, which followed Alex Honnold through his journey through his lifelong goal to free solo El Capitan. Now, the movie really intoxicated the rest of the world with the emotions and images faced by a big wall free soloist. Now, I'm a huge fan of both Jimmy Chin and Alex Honnold, and Alex Honnold to this day one of the greatest climbers of our generation, and one of the greatest athletic feats of all time, period. But the movie really helped to bring the behind the scenes of rock climbing and projecting and the life of that kind of a person to the general populace. And getting inside the mind of someone like Alex Honnold was really eye-opening for a lot of the world. Now, the last few years have really brought rock climbing as a sport to the main stage of the world. In 2020, it's going to be in the Olympics, which is an amazing benchmark for rock climbers around the world. And truly, I am passionate and proud to be a part of a sport that continues to push its own limits. How many sports do you know that continue to evolve at such a rapid pace? I mean, the hardest climb in the world continuously changes. People are continuously sending the new hardest climb in the world, which to me is incredible, that a sport can continue to push what is possible. And really, we're starting to approach the limits of the human body, in my opinion. I mean, did you see the things that Adam Ondra had to do to send Silence? I'll take a pass on that one, thank you. Now, climbing has also grown staggeringly in the last few years in terms of sheer popularity, just the number of people climbing. I can remember maybe 5 years ago, you'd go to a climbing gym and you would see just climbers. That's all that's there. But now you go to a climbing gym and you see other people too, normal people trying out the sport, and many of them will pick up a membership and start climbing regularly and become climbers. For me, it's a very positive thing to watch the sport grow in such a way. And I'm very proud to be a part of a sport that is continuously pushing its own limits, continuously evolving, becoming better. People are becoming stronger. We're really pushing the limits of what human bodies are capable of, and that's something to be proud of. And with that, I'm out of breath, so I'm going to start wrapping the video up. Now, this was again a brief history of rock climbing. I may have missed a few things, but feel free to do some research for yourself. There's many documented histories of rock climbing in different parts of the world that each show a different perspective. I encourage you to look into it for yourself because it will change your understanding of the sport. Thank you for watching, and remember to share the video with your friends and your loved ones while you still can. Love you.